At the anniversary dinner they hosted, my daughter-in-law suddenly decided to humiliate me in front of everyone, mockingly declaring that I had earned a seat far from the main table. The guests laughed awkwardly. My son said nothing, and I simply smiled because I knew in my bag was a folder, and among the guests sat someone she hadn't noticed, my lawyer. Everything she had tried to tear down had just gained a price, and she wasn't the one setting it. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Ellen Blake. I was 68 years old and had spent most of my adult life working as an executive secretary at a large law firm in Atlanta, Georgia. It was the kind of job that required precision, patience, and a memory like a steel trap. I worked under 4 managing partners across 30 years, each one with their own demands and habits, and I adapted to them all. I was the woman who never missed a deadline, never left a document unsigned, never forgot a single call. People relied on me. I was always reliable. When I retired, I thought I was finally entering a chapter of peace. My son Daniel and his wife Jessica had recently bought a spacious home in the suburbs. They had 2 children, Nina and Charlie, and when they suggested I move in with them, it felt like a generous gesture, a way to stay close, a way to be part of a family that had become my entire world. My husband had died 10 years prior, and aside from a few friends and church acquaintances, my circle had grown small. The offer seemed like a blessing. I moved into the guest room on the first floor, a neatly furnished space with beige walls, a large window, and a modest writing desk. At first, I felt grateful just to be included in their lives. I cooked dinners. I helped with school drop-offs. I folded laundry and made myself useful without being asked. Jessica told me more than once that I was a lifesaver. Daniel gave me tight hugs in the morning before leaving for work. The children would crawl into my lap without hesitation. I didn't need anything more than that. Or so I believed. Over time, the rhythm of the house changed. Or maybe it always had a certain rhythm, and I just hadn't noticed it until it started to exclude me. Jessica was efficient, always moving. She worked part-time as a freelance designer and prided herself on running the house like a well-oiled machine. Her routines were rigid, organic snacks only, scheduled screen time, minimalist aesthetics. My casseroles became too heavy. My habit of folding towels a certain way became outdated. She never said it harshly, but I felt the corrections tighten around me like a soft, invisible string. My chair at the dinner table gradually moved farther from the center. When guests visited, I was introduced casually. "This is Daniel's mom, Ellen. She's staying with us." Not living, not helping, just staying, as if I were a guest, as if I had no roots in that space. I started noticing how my presence was managed. Jessica would rearrange the pantry after I'd stocked it. She'd redo the kids' lunches after I'd packed them. She'd smile, tight-lipped, and say, "It's just easier this way." I understood that phrase. I'd used it myself for years in offices full of men who didn't want to be challenged. It was the phrase you used when you wanted someone to stop existing loudly. So I quieted. I stopped offering to cook unless asked. I only spoke when directly addressed during dinner. I took my tea to my room instead of lingering in the kitchen. My world shrank to the corners of their home that I was allowed to occupy. I told myself it was just transition, that Jessica was stressed, that I was imagining it. But the truth settled in slowly, like dust, thick, unspoken, undeniable. There was a moment, small but defining. Jessica had organized a neighborhood brunch. I helped clean, prepared a fruit tray, laid out the plates. When the guests arrived, she smiled brightly and took credit for the setup. She didn't mention me, didn't invite me to sit. I stood near the kitchen archway, half listening to conversations I wasn't part of, holding an empty glass I didn't remember pouring. That night, I stared at the ceiling for a long time, not angry, not even sad, just noticing. I realized I was living in a home where I was helpful but not seen, present but peripheral. My decades of work, my accumulated wisdom, my quiet kindness, all had become background noise to people who were too busy to hear me. And what hurt most wasn't that I was invisible to strangers. It was that I was becoming invisible to my own son. The shift wasn't sudden. It crept in quietly, like a draft beneath a closed door. I couldn't name the day it began, only that slowly, I no longer belonged where I once felt welcome. At first, there were changes in the routine. Jessica started waking earlier than me to prepare the children's lunches, something I had done religiously since moving in. I would come into the kitchen to find everything already packed and placed by the front door. At first, I thanked her for taking the initiative, thinking perhaps she was just having a productive morning. But then it happened again and again, until it was no longer a kind gesture, but a pattern, one that excluded me. Then came the reorganization of the pantry. I had always kept it stocked, carefully labeling containers and ensuring there was a balance of food for everyone. Jessica removed the labels, replaced the jars with minimalist glass ones, and rearranged the shelves according to her own system. When I asked where she'd put the baking powder, she smiled without looking up and said, "I'm just streamlining a bit. Hope that's okay." I told her it was fine. What else could I say? It was her house, her kitchen, her rules. Gradually, all the small tasks I had filled my days with were absorbed back into her orbit. She began planning weekly meals without asking for input. She scheduled the kids' dentist appointments, signed the permission slips, handled the laundry. I went from being a support to a redundancy, from being involved to being politely ignored. It wasn't just the tasks, it was the atmosphere. The tone of the house shifted. Jessica's voice, once light and polite, took on a clipped efficiency when addressing me. Daniel was often at work, and when he was home, he seemed tired, distracted. He didn't notice the difference in tone, or maybe he did and chose not to see it. Conversations over dinner grew more strained. I became careful with my words. If I offered a suggestion about school, the budget, or even what to make on a Sunday, Jessica would nod politely, then do something entirely different. When I brought it up once, she said, "We appreciate your experience, Ellen, but things work a little differently these days." I heard what she meant. She didn't want advice. She wanted quiet compliance. It was around this time that she began speaking about me as if I weren't in the room. During one particularly uncomfortable conversation with a friend on speakerphone, she laughed and said, "It's like having an extra pair of hands around, but with opinions." I had just walked into the room when she said it. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. I began spending more time in my room. I found small ways to occupy myself, reading, journaling, organizing old photographs. I even tried puzzles, though I'd never had the patience for them before. The silence of my days felt different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was empty. What stung most wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. No one thanked me anymore. No one noticed when I made tea, when I folded a load of towels, when I wiped down the counters after they'd gone to bed. I had become a background fixture in my own family's life. And then came the money. It happened during an offhand conversation in the driveway. Jessica was on a call with someone, her tone more animated than usual. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her voice carried. No, we didn't need to take a second loan, she said. Daniel's mom contributed a chunk when we bought the house. Yeah, I know, but technically it was a gift, so we didn't put her on the paperwork. A gift? That word lodged in my chest like a stone. I had cashed out a savings bond and liquidated a CD to help with their down payment. It hadn't been a small amount. At the time, I had told myself it was family. It was love. I hadn't asked for my name on the deed, but I also hadn't imagined they would use that to erase my stake in this house altogether. That night, I went to bed with a migraine pulsing behind my eyes. I began questioning everything. Had I misread their invitation to live with them? Was this always the arrangement? Be useful, stay quiet, and never assume importance? My heart hurt in the way it does when you realize the warmth you thought you were feeling was just proximity, not affection, not belonging, just convenience. I knew I had to protect myself, not emotionally, though that too, but practically. I had spent my life among lawyers. I understood contracts, documentation, the quiet power of written proof. And something in me, something sharp and long neglected, woke up. I began to gather things, quietly, carefully, because I could feel the wind changing, and I didn't intend to be swept away. I had always been the kind of woman who kept records. It came with the territory. 30 years in a law office teaches you that the smallest detail can unravel or secure everything. A misplaced form, a missing signature, a date written incorrectly, these things matter. And so, quietly, I began to apply that instinct to my own life. It started with the files. I pulled out the folder from my locked suitcase, the one I had brought with me when I first moved in with Daniel and Jessica. Inside were receipts, wire confirmations, and a printed email thread between me and Daniel where we discussed the contribution I was making to the house purchase. There were no dramatic declarations, but the facts were there in black and white. I hadn't given them that money as a gift. I had transferred it to help secure a future, not to vanish into it. I made copies. I stored one set at the bottom of my old knitting basket, wrapped in a manila envelope beneath skeins of unused yarn. The other I mailed to myself, unopened and dated. A lawyer I once worked for taught me that trick. Mail it to yourself and never open it. It's a poor man's copyright, but admissible enough to cause pause. I found the original purchase agreement in Daniel's desk drawer. I didn't take it. I didn't photograph it, but I read it. My name wasn't there, not even in a footnote. That night, I sat up late, the glow of the bedside lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. I thought about how many things I had done in my life without asking for recognition, how often I had told myself that being generous meant expecting nothing in return, that love meant sacrificing without keeping score. But there's a difference between giving freely and being erased. I didn't want a battle. I didn't want to fracture the little bit of peace I had left with my son and grandchildren. But I also knew that I could no longer afford to stand in the background of my own life, waiting for permission to be seen. And so I called John. John Whitmore had been a junior partner at my firm back in the 80s. He was smart, steady, and kind in a way most lawyers aren't. We had shared more than a few lunches, exchanged holiday cards for decades, and even once danced together at a retirement party. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I still had his number. He picked up on the second ring. When I introduced myself, he chuckled warmly and asked how many people I had sued since retirement. I told him none, yet. We met for lunch a few days later. I brought the documents. He brought a notepad and that same calm presence I had always admired. I explained the situation carefully, methodically. I kept my voice steady. I didn't cry. When I finished, he nodded. Then he looked at me for a long time before speaking. You know, he said. Most people wouldn't have noticed it happening until it was too late. You saw it. You documented it. That matters. We talked through options, legal and otherwise. He offered to draft a formal letter requesting an accounting of the funds and proposing a reevaluation of the property ownership. I told him not yet, not unless it became necessary, because what I needed more than a court ruling was a sense of control. I had spent too long being strategic for other people. It was time to do the same for myself. After that lunch, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Grounded, not angry, not vindictive, just clear. I began noticing things more sharply. The way Jessica took calls in hushed tones when I entered a room. The way Daniel avoided eye contact when money was mentioned. The way my name disappeared from discussions about the house, about vacations, about anything that implied permanence or importance. And I stopped blaming myself. There is a kind of loneliness that comes with realizing you are being tolerated rather than cherished. But there is also a kind of power in facing it, in choosing not to beg for love where only silence greets you. I didn't confront them. I didn't hint. I didn't throw accusations into the air like confetti. Instead, I gathered facts. I reinforced my boundaries. And I waited, because something told me the moment was coming, the moment where they would try to shrink me one more time. And that time, I would not bow. I would rise, and I would be ready. The invitation came on a Monday morning. Jessica left a card on my dresser, formal, white, embossed with gold letters. It was an invitation to a dinner party she and Daniel were hosting for their 7th wedding anniversary. They had invited several friends, a few co-workers, and some neighbors. The note was brief and impersonal. We'd love for you to attend. Dress nicely. Dinner starts at 7. There was no warmth in her words, no signature, just the assumption that I would, of course, be there. It wasn't the first dinner party they'd thrown, but it was the first time in a while I'd been explicitly invited. More often than not, I was either asked to watch the kids during their events or expected to stay behind the scenes, serve the wine, clear the plates, slip away before the real conversation began. I stood at the window holding the invitation, watching the wind move through the trees. Something in me stirred, something old and quiet, like the first breath after holding it too long. This time, I wouldn't be their helper. I wouldn't wear something neutral or sit at the edge of the room waiting to be needed. I would attend as a guest, as a presence, as a woman with her own story. I called John the next day. He answered immediately. I told him about the dinner, told him I had a feeling. He didn't ask what kind. He just said, "Would you like me to come?" I paused for a second, then said yes. We agreed he'd arrive separately, as a friend of mine from work, which was the truth. Jessica wouldn't recognize him. She rarely cared about the details of my life beyond what was useful to her. That Saturday, I prepared myself with a kind of calm precision I hadn't felt in years. I wore a navy blue dress with soft silk lining, one I hadn't taken out of the closet since Daniel's college graduation. I paired it with a silver brooch I had inherited from my mother, and I pinned my hair back with care. I looked in the mirror and saw someone I almost didn't recognize, not because I looked different, but because I looked fully present. Before I left my room, I slipped a slim folder into my purse. Inside were copies of the documents John and I had discussed, the bank transfers, the email threads, the accounting records. Not to use, but to have. The house was already buzzing when I stepped into the hallway. Jessica was lighting candles and adjusting flower arrangements. She glanced at me and said, "Oh good, you're ready," before turning back to her centerpiece. Guests arrived one by one, colleagues in polished suits, women with fresh manicures and practiced laughter. I recognized a few from past events, but most were strangers. I greeted them with polite nods and found a seat in the living room. No one offered me a glass of wine. John arrived exactly on time. He looked sharp, gray blazer, white shirt, calm eyes that missed nothing. He greeted me like an old friend, which he was, and introduced himself to Jessica with a warm handshake. She smiled without curiosity and asked how we knew each other. I told her we worked together years ago. She nodded and moved on. Dinner was served on time. Jessica and Daniel took their places at the head of the table. I was seated near the end, next to a woman who talked endlessly about her home renovations. I listened quietly, nodding when appropriate. The evening unfolded in a blur of wine and small talk. Laughter rang out in high, practiced tones. Jessica was in her element, orchestrating conversation, performing charm. Daniel followed her lead, as he often did. Then, somewhere between dessert and digestives, Jessica stood and tapped her glass. She gave a speech thanking everyone for coming, for supporting their journey, for celebrating their success. She spoke about love, about partnership, about growth. Then, as if remembering something amusing, she gestured toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And, of course, we're grateful to have Daniel's mother with us," she said. "Ellen's always been such a quiet supporter. You know, someone who understands her place in the background, which honestly is a rare gift these days." There was a flicker of nervous laughter around the table. Daniel didn't look up. I didn't react. I reached slowly into my purse, retrieved the folder, and placed it gently in front of me on the table. Jessica kept speaking, but her words blurred. John looked at me and gave the slightest nod. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I waited for Jessica to finish her toast. I waited for the last clink of glass. Then I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply thanked everyone for coming, and then said that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stop accepting invisibility. I didn't explain. I didn't point fingers, but Jessica saw the folder, and she saw John. And suddenly, the room shifted, not loudly, but absolutely. I stayed standing for a moment longer than necessary, not to make a point, not to dominate the room, but to reclaim something that had been slowly stripped away over the years: my presence. The kind that couldn't be brushed aside or laughed off or shifted to the corner of a room. Jessica's smile twitched. The lines around her mouth tightened. She tried to recover with a light chuckle, raising her glass as if to diffuse a tension she herself had introduced. But the air had already changed. You could feel it in the silence, the kind that hums just below the surface when something real has slipped into the room full of practiced laughter and polished etiquette. I sat down slowly. The folder remained unopened, resting beside my plate. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a simple, quiet reminder that I knew more than they thought I did, that I had not only seen everything happening around me, but that I had kept a record. Jessica leaned slightly toward me, her voice low but tight. She whispered something about timing and not making a scene. Her eyes darted briefly toward John, who sat calm and unreadable, sipping his water as if we were merely discussing the weather. I didn't answer her. I simply turned to John and asked if he would mind helping me to the kitchen to get some air. He stood without hesitation and offered me his arm. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it sent another ripple through the room. One of recognition. This wasn't just an old friend. He was someone who mattered, someone who made people uncomfortable, not because he was unkind, but because he disrupted their assumptions. We stepped into the hallway, and for a few minutes I breathed in the quiet. I didn't need a break. I needed space to decide what came next. John waited. He always had a gift for silence, not the cold kind, but the patient kind. Finally, I told him that I was ready, not for confrontation, but for clarity. We returned to the dining room just as Jessica was pouring coffee, her tone overly bright, her movements a little too precise. She had taken the reins of the room again, trying to stitch the atmosphere back together with casual conversation and compliments, but the thread had already snapped. I didn't raise my voice when I spoke. I didn't call attention to myself. I simply thanked Jessica again for the lovely dinner, then added that I had brought a few things with me, documents to be specific, that I had been meaning to discuss with her and Daniel privately, but given the moment, perhaps now was just as good. The room fell quiet. Daniel looked up for the first time in what felt like an hour, his brow furrowed, confused. Jessica went pale. I reached into the folder, pulled out one of the documents, my bank transfer, dated and signed, and placed it gently on the table between them. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. John introduced himself then, calmly, formally. He stated his full name and professional title. He explained that he had been retained to assist me in reviewing my financial contributions to the purchase of their home and to ensure those contributions were properly accounted for in the event of any future legal reclassification. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't accuse. He stated facts, slowly, clearly. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel looked like he had swallowed something sharp. Around the table, the guests stared, not with shock or scandal, but with the kind of quiet discomfort that comes when the masks fall away and something true is finally laid bare. No one touched their coffee. Jessica tried to laugh. She said it wasn't necessary, that we could talk about this another time, that we were family. But I had heard that word too many times used as a shield for bad behavior. I thanked everyone for their time. I looked at Jessica directly and said that I had come that evening not to create division, but to remind her that people like me, women who gave and gave without asking, were not invisible, and we were not weak. Then I stood. John stood with me. We left the dinner without rushing, without slamming doors, without drama. But the silence we left behind said more than any argument ever could. It said, "You tried to make a point, and I made one back." The morning after the dinner, I woke to silence, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but waited, still and dense, like the air before a thunderstorm. I made coffee slowly, letting the process steady my hands. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting pale light across the tile, but it did nothing to cut the heaviness in the air. By the time I finished my first cup, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to hear whatever version of guilt or panic he was going to offer. Instead, I listened to the voicemail he left a few minutes later. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't realized how things had gotten. He said he wished I had come to him directly. He said he wanted to fix this without lawyers. That last part almost made me laugh. He didn't understand that the involvement of a lawyer hadn't been an escalation. It had been protection. A quiet boundary drawn after years of being edged out and made small. I didn't call him back. Later that day, a message arrived from Jessica. It was short, defensive. She said she felt humiliated, that I had made her look bad in front of their friends, that she never meant to exclude me, but that I had overreacted. I read the message twice and didn't respond. There was nothing in it that asked for understanding, only control. That week, I met with John again. We went over the documents, and he helped me formally draft a request for an accounting of the property investment. It was polite, professional, and legally sound. I mailed it with my own hands, the envelope sealed with finality I hadn't known I was craving. Jessica didn't reply directly, but I knew she received it. Daniel sent a terse email 3 days later asking if we could just talk this out. I replied that I was always open to respectful conversation, but not to dismissals. They didn't respond again. I started packing a few days after that. I had stayed in their house too long. Even before the dinner, I had been emotionally halfway gone. Now, I was ready to leave entirely. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, modest, quiet, with a little balcony that faced the west. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The act of filling boxes was almost meditative. I packed slowly, carefully. I took only what belonged to me. A few books, my framed photographs, the porcelain tea set I'd inherited from my mother, my collection of scarves. I left the rest, every dish I had washed, every toy I had picked up, every piece of furniture I had once believed was shared. The night before I left, Daniel came home early. He stood in the doorway of my room and watched me seal a box. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. He asked me if this was what I really wanted. I told him no. I had never wanted it to come to this, but I had wanted respect. I had wanted a voice. I had wanted to be seen. And when those things weren't given, I had learned how to take them back. He nodded slowly, and for a moment he looked like the boy I had raised. Earnest, uncertain, full of questions. He said he hoped someday things could be better. I said they already were. The move was quiet. John helped with the paperwork for the apartment. A kind neighbor helped me carry in a few heavier boxes. I arranged my furniture how I liked it. I stocked the kitchen with the foods I wanted. I lit a candle that smelled like lavender and honey and let the scent fill every corner of my new space. And I exhaled. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was taking up space that didn't belong to me. I wasn't calculating my words or shrinking myself into the shape of someone else's expectations. I was simply living. Later that month, the formal agreement came through. Jessica and Daniel agreed to reimburse my original investment in the house. John sent me the final documents with a small note attached. "You did this with grace. Never forget that." I pinned that note to my fridge, not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me that grace and strength weren't opposites. They lived together in quiet women who had spent their lives making things easier for others. Now I was learning to make things easier for myself, and I was just getting started. The first few weeks in my new apartment passed quietly. It was a kind of quiet I hadn't realized I'd missed. Not the silence of exclusion, but the silence of freedom. There was no tension lingering in the corners, no expectations hovering above each decision I made. Every object in that small space reflected me and only me. It was not grand, but it was honest. I rearranged furniture without seeking anyone's approval. I hung pictures on the walls that made me smile, not because they matched a design scheme, but because they meant something to me. I bought sunflowers from the corner market every Saturday and placed them by the window where the afternoon light hit just right. I drank tea from the chipped mug I loved instead of the pristine cups Jessica used to insist on for guests. Each small act of choice stitched me back together. Daniel visited for the first time 2 weeks after the move. He brought a bouquet of lilies, my favorite, and 2 coffees from the cafe he used to beg me to take him to as a child. When he was little, he'd press his face to the pastry display, eyes wide, asking for a cinnamon roll every time. Sometimes I let him have one. Other times I told him we'd come back another day, and we always did. He didn't say much at first. He walked through the apartment slowly, touching the back of a chair, pausing at the window, nodding quietly. He said it felt peaceful. I told him that it was. But in his eyes, I saw something more than agreement. I saw recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman I'd always been, now no longer hidden beneath years of being useful. He stayed for an hour. We talked about the kids, about work, about how the house felt strange without me. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't apologize, but something in his voice softened when he asked how I was sleeping, if I was eating well, if I needed anything. He hadn't asked those questions in years. After that, he came by once or twice a month, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone. He never brought Jessica. I never asked why. It was enough. The visits were not filled with grand revelations or deep confessions. They were simple, comfortable. I made cookies, his favorites with orange zest like his father used to love. Daniel would fix a loose hinge on my bathroom door or change the filter in the AC without asking. We watched old sitcoms together, laughing at the same parts we always had. The familiarity was there, but the dynamic had changed. There was no pressure, no subtle demands, just time shared equally. And in those quiet hours, my mind often wandered back to his childhood, to the boy who once fell asleep in my lap after too much sun at the park, to the boy who used to leave sticky fingerprints on the fridge door and cry when his shoelaces came undone, to the boy who hugged me so tightly on his first day of school that I almost didn't let go. I also thought of his father, Michael, strong hands, quiet voice. He used to carry Daniel on his shoulders during evening walks through the neighborhood, humming tunelessly while Daniel pointed at airplanes overhead. Michael was the one who insisted we teach Daniel to swim, even when I was nervous. "He'll float," he said. "You just have to trust." He always believed in Daniel before Daniel believed in himself. We had a good life, Michael and I. Not perfect, but full of the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken every day to be felt. The kind that lived in routines, in the way he'd pour me coffee before I even sat down, or how he'd rest his hand on my back during dinner, like a quiet reminder, I'm here. After he passed, I poured everything into Daniel. I was afraid of losing more, so I held tighter, maybe too tight sometimes. Maybe that's why it took him so long to see me again, as someone beyond the role I filled. What surprised me now was how much more he began to notice. He commented on the books I left open by the armchair. He asked about the journal I kept on the coffee table. He asked what I was writing, where I had learned to make that soup. If I remembered a story he only half recalled from childhood, it felt like he was finally seeing me not as an extension of his life, but as someone with a life of her own. And I cherished that. Jessica never reached out, not once. No calls, no messages, no invitations. At first, I wondered if I should feel bitter about that, but I didn't. Her silence was not a punishment. It was space, and I had learned how to breathe in space. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend from the law office. She was surprised to see me smiling, asked what had changed. I told her the truth. I had learned how to respect myself again. She asked me if I was angry with my family. I told her I wasn't. I had been maybe once, but anger was heavy. I had carried it for long enough. What I felt now was something quieter, a calm assurance that I had done the right thing, that I had drawn a line, and for the first time in a long time, someone didn't just step over it. They paused. Respect didn't mean people showered me with praise. It didn't mean they did what I asked or changed overnight. It meant they stopped assuming they could write my story for me. One morning, I received a card in the mail from Daniel. Inside was a simple sentence, written in his careful, familiar handwriting. "I see you now." That was all. No signature, no flourish. But I held that card for a long time. Because that sentence, in all its simplicity, meant more than any apology ever could. He saw me, not just as his mother, not just as someone who had given, but as someone who still had more to live, more to offer, on her own terms. The older I got, the more I understood something I had never dared to voice when I was younger. That peace had a price, and so did self-respect. And the cost of staying small, of being agreeable, of always folding yourself around other people's comfort. That cost was invisible, but it was steep. I had been paying it for decades, and I finally stopped. In the weeks after I settled into my new life, the rhythm of my days began to feel like a melody I was composing from scratch. I wasn't just rebuilding, I was redefining. For the first time in my life, I wasn't adjusting to someone else's schedule, moods, or needs. I was simply following my own. I started volunteering at the community legal aid office once a week, just filing, organizing, answering the phone. Nothing flashy, but it felt good to be surrounded by the hum of people who still believed in fairness. Some of the interns looked at me like I was just the nice retired lady who brought muffins. They didn't know that I had once typed up depositions that made people cry, that I could still spot a missing clause in a contract from across the room. And I didn't need them to know. I knew. That was enough. I joined a small book club at the local library. Most of the women were in their 60s and 70s. We didn't always agree on the stories, but we showed up every Thursday, rain or shine, and we talked, really talked, about loss, about joy, about regret, about becoming. That circle of women became my home more than any place had in years. They didn't care who I had once been to other people. They cared who I was now, and I was still figuring that out. But I was doing it out loud, in good company. Sometimes I sat on my balcony in the evenings, a cup of peppermint tea cooling beside me, and I'd think about everything that had happened. The house, the humiliation, the decision to bring a lawyer to a dinner party. It could have been a scandal, a joke. But instead, it became the moment I finally stopped shrinking. I remembered the look on Jessica's face when she realized I had come prepared, not to fight, but to protect myself. I remembered how Daniel's voice cracked when he said, "I didn't know." And I believed him. But not knowing didn't make it right, and forgiving didn't mean forgetting. I had paid my price, in silence, in service, in swallowed words and broken boundaries, and now it was my turn to name the value of my own worth. One afternoon, a neighbor asked if I was ever lonely. I thought about it honestly. Sometimes I missed the children, their footsteps down the hallway, their laughter. I missed Daniel in small ways, the way he used to play music too loud on Sunday mornings, or how he always burned toast. But lonely? Not exactly. I felt spacious. I felt free. I felt sovereign. That's a word I don't think women my age use enough. Sovereign. As in possessing the right to rule our own space, our own time, our own stories. I started writing again. Nothing grand, just little vignettes, small reflections. I wrote about my mother's voice when she used to hum while cooking, about the way my hands had aged, about the stillness of a room that holds no expectations. I didn't write for praise. I wrote to witness myself, finally. Sometimes I got letters from Daniel. He started sending them instead of texts. Maybe he understood I needed something slower, more thoughtful. His handwriting always looked a little rushed, like he was still learning how to say things that mattered. In one letter, he wrote, "I used to think you were just quiet. Now I know you were carrying everything, and we never asked how heavy it was." I kept that one pinned on my fridge. Jessica never reached out, and that was fine. I didn't need reconciliation to move on. Some chapters end without resolution. Some doors close without slamming. Her silence was its own answer. I didn't tell my story to many people, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't need to prove anything. The people who needed to know already knew, and those who didn't, they never saw me clearly anyway. But if I could tell any woman what I've learned, I'd tell her this. The moment someone tries to put you in your place, remember that your place is not up for negotiation. Your worth is not situational. You are not background noise. You are not a placeholder. You are the whole damn story. And if you have to bring a lawyer to the table just to be heard, then do it. Because there is a kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop paying for everyone else's comfort with your own voice. That peace isn't free, but it is worth every cent. And I paid it gladly.